The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in early October, 6 weeks after Sarah and David had moved into the foreman's cabin. Marcus was sitting on his porch, watching David practice throwing pine cones at a target they'd set up against an old stump, when he heard Sarah's voice through the cabin's open window, tight with fear. "Please, Mom, you have to understand. We're safe here. We're happy here." Marcus couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but Sarah's responses told him everything he needed to know. "No, I can't tell you exactly where we are, because he has lawyers, Mom. Good ones. I know you think I'm overreacting, but you didn't see what he was like those last few months." David missed his throw, and the pine cone sailed past the stump into the bushes. He looked toward the cabin, his small face creased with worry at his mother's tone. "Why is Mama upset?" David asked quietly. Marcus felt a familiar protective anger rise in his chest, the same feeling he'd had when he'd realized Sarah and David were running from something more than just grief. Over the past 6 weeks, he'd learned to read the signs in both of them. The way Sarah still jumped when a car door slammed unexpectedly. How David sometimes woke up crying from nightmares he couldn't or wouldn't explain. The careful way Sarah avoided talking about David's father, always referring to him in the past tense, but never explaining how or when he'd died. Now, listening to Sarah's conversation, Marcus was beginning to understand that David's father might not be dead at all. "Come on, buddy," Marcus said to David. "Let's go for a walk while your mama finishes her phone call." They walked the familiar trail that led to Marcus's favorite spot overlooking the valley, David chattering about the tree fort Marcus had promised to help him build. But when they reached the clearing, David grew quiet and serious. "Marcus," he said, using the name he'd started calling him after the first week, "are bad people going to find us here?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. "What makes you ask that, David?" "Sometimes Mama cries when she thinks I'm sleeping, and sometimes she looks out the window like she's watching for someone." David picked up a stick and drew patterns in the dirt. "Before we came here, a man used to make Mama cry a lot. He was mean to her, and sometimes he was mean to me too." Marcus knelt down so he was at David's eye level, his heart breaking for this little boy who'd already seen too much of the world's cruelty. "David, look at me," Marcus said gently. "I want you to know something, okay? As long as you and your mama are here, I'm going to make sure nobody hurts either of you. That's a promise." "But what if he finds us?" David whispered. "Then he'll have to deal with me," Marcus said simply. "And I'm pretty good at protecting the people I care about." David studied Marcus's face with the serious expression that sometimes made him seem much older than his 8 years. "Do you care about us?" The question was so direct, so innocent, that Marcus felt his throat close up. When had this happened? When had a lonely lumberjack's life become so intertwined with a woman and child that the thought of losing them felt like losing everything? "Yeah, buddy," Marcus said hoarsely. "I care about you both very much." David threw his arms around Marcus's neck, and Marcus hugged him back, breathing in the scent of pine trees and childhood that had become so familiar over the past weeks. When they returned to the cabin, Sarah was standing on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warm evening. She looked up when she heard their footsteps, and Marcus saw the fear she was trying to hide behind a smile. "There you are," she said. "I was wondering where my two favorite explorers had gotten to." "We went to see the valley," David announced. "And Marcus said he's going to protect us from bad people." Sarah's face went white, and her eyes flew to Marcus's. In that moment, he saw confirmation of everything he'd suspected and more. This wasn't a widow seeking a fresh start. This was a woman who'd fled from an abusive husband, taking her child, and running toward the only safety she could find. "David, sweetie, why don't you go wash up for dinner?" Sarah said carefully. "I need to talk to Marcus for a minute." After David disappeared into the cabin, Sarah and Marcus stood in the growing twilight, the weight of unspoken truths hanging between them. "How much do you know?" Sarah asked finally. "I know David's father isn't dead," Marcus said quietly. "I know you're afraid of him. And I know that phone call tonight scared you." Sarah sank down onto the porch steps, her composure finally cracking. "That was my mother. She says Brad's been calling her, asking if she's heard from us. He's telling people I kidnapped David, that I'm mentally unstable, that he just wants his son back safely." Marcus sat down beside her, careful not to crowd her, but close enough that she'd know he was there. What's the truth? The truth is that Brad Chun is a controlling, manipulative man who spent 3 years systematically destroying my self-esteem and making me believe I was crazy. Sarah's voice was flat, emotionless, like she was reciting facts from a case file. He never hit me where it would show, never left marks that couldn't be explained away. And he was always so charming to everyone else. The perfect husband and father. Marcus felt rage building in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. What about David? Brad ignored David when he was happy and screamed at him when he was stressed. He called him stupid, worthless, said David was too sensitive, too weak. An 8-year-old boy, Marcus. Sarah's voice broke. I kept thinking maybe if I tried harder, if I was a better wife, if David was quieter, more obedient, but it never mattered. Brad's anger was about Brad, not about anything we did or didn't do. So you left. I tried to leave legally, filed for divorce, asked for custody. But Brad has money and connections. His law firm handles cases for half the judges in Nevada. My lawyer told me it would be a long, expensive fight with no guarantee I'd win. Meanwhile, Brad was getting angrier, more violent. I was afraid of what he might do if I pushed him too far. Marcus understood now why Sarah had been so wary of him at first, why she still sometimes flinched when he moved too quickly or raised his voice even in laughter. She'd been trained to expect violence from the men in her life. So you ran? Marcus said. One night, Brad came home drunk and grabbed David by the arm so hard he left bruises. Started shaking him, screaming about how David had left his toys in the living room. I knew if I didn't get David out of there that night, I might not get another chance. They sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the forest settling into evening. Finally, Sarah spoke again. My mother says Brad hired a private investigator. Says he's determined to find us and bring David home. She thinks I should go back, work things out for David's sake. Sarah laughed bitterly. For David's sake. As if destroying a child's sense of safety is somehow good for him. What do you want to do? Marcus asked. I want to stay here, Sarah said without hesitation. These past 6 weeks have been the happiest David and I have been in years. He's laughing again, sleeping through the night, excited about learning new things. You've been more of a father figure to him in 6 weeks than Brad ever was in 8 years. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition of a truth he'd been avoiding. Somewhere between teaching David to whittle and watching Sarah transform his chaotic office into a model of efficiency, he'd started thinking of them as his family. Not just tenants or employees, but the family he'd never thought he'd have. Sarah, he said carefully, there's something I need to tell you. She looked at him with those brown eyes that had learned to be wary but were slowly remembering how to trust. I'm falling in love with you, Marcus said simply. With both of you. And I know that probably complicates everything, but I needed you to know. Because if Bradchen wants to take David away from you, he's going to have to go through me first. Sarah stared at him for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. Marcus, you don't understand what you're saying. Brad has money, lawyers, influence. He could destroy your business, your reputation. He's done it before to people who try to help me. Let him try, Marcus said fiercely. I've been living half a life for 3 years, hiding out in these woods like a wounded animal. You and David changed that. You made me remember what it feels like to have something worth fighting for. And if he wins, if he takes David away, then we'll figure out another plan. But I'm not going to let fear make our decisions for us. Marcus turned to face her fully. Sarah, will you marry me? She blinked in shock. What? I know it sounds crazy, and I know we haven't known each other very long, but if you're my wife and David is my stepson, legally that changes things. It gives us standing to fight back, gives David another advocate in court. Marcus took her hands in his. But more than that, I love you. Both of you. I want to build a life with you, here in these woods where David can grow up safe and happy. Marcus, that's not fair to you. You'd be taking on a fight that isn't yours, problems that have nothing to do with you. It became my fight the moment I fell in love with David's mother, Marcus said quietly. The moment that little boy started calling me Marcus instead of Mr. Hayworth. The moment you trusted me enough to tell me the truth about why you came here. Sarah was crying in earnest now, but there was something in her face that looked like hope blooming after a long winter. Are you sure? She whispered. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. They were interrupted by David's voice from the cabin doorway. Why are you and Mama crying? He asked, concerned. Marcus and Sarah looked at each other, and then Sarah held out her arms to her son. David came running, and they pulled him into a three-way hug right there on the porch steps. We're crying because we're happy, Sarah told David, smoothing his hair. Marcus asked if we'd like to be a real family, officially. David pulled back to look at Marcus with wide eyes. Like, you'd be my dad. If you'd want me to be, Marcus said, his heart hammering. Would I get to keep your last name? If your mama says yes, then yes. You'd be David Hayworth. David thought about this seriously. David Hayworth, he said, testing it out. I like it. It sounds strong. You are strong, Marcus said. Both of you are. And, together, we're stronger than any bad person who might try to hurt our family. 3 months later, Marcus Hayworth stood in the small chapel in town, watching Sarah walk down the aisle in a simple white dress with wildflowers in her hair. David was beside him in his role as best man, holding the rings they'd picked out together in Portland. Sally Morrison was crying in the front row, and half the town had shown up to witness the marriage of the reclusive lumberjack who'd surprised everyone by falling in love with the mysterious woman and her son who'd come out of nowhere. But what mattered most to Marcus was the expression on Sarah's face as she approached the altar. Gone was the wariness, the fear that had shadowed her eyes when they'd first met. In its place was joy, pure and uncomplicated, the look of a woman who'd finally found her way home. The private investigator Brad had hired did eventually track them down, but by then, Marcus and Sarah were legally married. David had a stepfather who loved him unconditionally, and the three of them had built something stronger than fear. When Brad showed up at the logging site one cold morning in December, demanding to see his son, he found himself facing not a frightened woman alone with her child, but a united family backed by an entire community that had watched David Hayworth flourish over the past months. You must be Brad, Marcus said calmly, not setting down his chainsaw but not making any threatening moves either. Sarah told me you might show up eventually. Brad was exactly what Marcus had expected, expensively dressed, perfectly groomed, with the kind of cold eyes that promised cruelty hiding behind a charming smile. Where's my son? Brad demanded. David's in school, Marcus replied. Same as every weekday. Doing real well, by the way. Honor roll last quarter. Seems to like having a stable home environment. You can't keep me from seeing my own child, Brad snarled, the mask slipping slightly. Actually, I can, Marcus said pleasantly. See, David's my stepson now. Legally adopted as of last month. And his mother has a restraining order against you that covers our entire property. So unless you want to explain to the sheriff why you're violating a court order, I suggest you get back in that fancy car and drive away. Brad's face went red with rage. This isn't over. I have rights. I have lawyers. Good for you, Marcus said. Sarah's got lawyers too now. Amazing what you can afford when your husband owns a successful business, and the whole community is backing you up. As Brad drove away, tires spinning gravel, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Let the man try his legal tricks. David Hayworth was exactly where he belonged, with parents who loved him and a community that would protect him. That evening, as Marcus helped David with his homework at the kitchen table while Sarah cooked dinner, the boy looked up from his math worksheet with a thoughtful expression. Marcus, David said, do you remember that day when you found me and Mama stuck in the ditch? I remember, Marcus said. Do you think maybe that wasn't an accident? Maybe it was supposed to happen so we could all find each other. Marcus looked across the kitchen at Sarah, who was smiling as she stirred something that smelled like home on the stove. Through the window, he could see the forest where he'd spent so many years alone, now filled with the laughter of a child who climbed trees and asked endless questions about everything. You know what, buddy? Marcus said, pulling David closer for a one-armed hug. I think you might be right about that. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, blanketing the forest in pristine white. But inside the cabin that had once been silent and empty, a family was building memories around a dinner table, safe and warm, and finally, home point 3 days after pulling Sarah and David Chin out of that ditch, Marcus Hayworth made a discovery that would change everything. He was having coffee at Millie's Diner, The same booth he'd occupied every Thursday morning for the past 5 years, when Sally Morrison slid into the seat across from him with a troubled expression. "Marcus," Sally said without preamble, "I need to talk to you about those folks you sent my way. The woman and her boy." Marcus set down his coffee cup, immediately alert. "Something wrong? They seemed like good people." "They are good people," Sally said quickly. "That's not the problem. The problem is they've been at my motel for 3 days now, and that woman is stretching every dollar like it's made of gold. She's been buying the cheapest food at the market, splitting single portions between her and the boy, and I can see her counting change every time she pays for another night." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "Money troubles?" "Worse than that." Sally lowered her voice. "Yesterday I saw her in the parking lot on the phone, and she was crying. Real quiet-like, trying not to let the boy see. After she hung up, she just sat in her car for the longest time, holding her head in her hands." "Did you talk to her?" "I tried. Brought them some leftover pie from the diner, told her it was going to go bad anyway. She was grateful, but proud too. You know the type. She thanked me about 6 times, and then asked if there was any work around town she could do to earn her keep." Marcus knew the type very well. He'd been that type himself when his logging business had nearly failed in its first year. "What did you tell her?" "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," Sally said. "There's not much work in town for a woman with a young boy to care for. Seasonal stuff at the tourist shops, but that's months away. And she's got no references, no local connections." Sally paused. "But I was thinking about what you said the other day about needing help with your books and organizing your business." Marcus blinked. "I never said anything about needing help with books." "Maybe not in those exact words," Sally said with a slight smile. "But I've been watching you struggle with paperwork for years, Marcus. Remember when you missed that tax deadline because you couldn't find your receipts? Or when you lost that contract with Henderson Lumber because you forgot to return their call?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Sally wasn't wrong. Administrative work had always been his weakness, but he'd managed to muddle through on his own. "I don't know, Sally. Hiring someone seems like a big step." "I'm not talking about hiring," Sally said. "I'm talking about helping. That woman needs work, you need organization, and from what I can see, that little boy could use some stability in his life." Before Marcus could respond, the diner door chimed, and Sarah Chun walked in with David at her side. The boy's eyes lit up when he saw Marcus, and he immediately started tugging on his mother's hand. "Mama, look, it's the tree man who helped us." Sarah's face flushed slightly as she approached their booth. "Mr. Hayworth, I'm sorry to interrupt. David insisted we say hello." "No interruption at all," Marcus said, standing up. "How are you folks settling in?" "Very well, thank you," Sarah said. But Marcus could see the tension around her eyes, the careful way she held herself. "Mrs. Morrison has been incredibly kind." Sally stood up and gently ruffled David's hair. "Why don't you two join us? I was just telling Marcus here about your conversation yesterday." Sarah's face went pale. "Mrs. Morrison, I didn't mean to impose or—" "Honey, sit down," Sally said firmly but kindly. "Nobody's imposing on anybody. We're just neighbors talking about neighbors." David had already climbed into the booth next to Marcus, fascinated by the logging equipment catalog that lay open on the table. "Is this your book?" David asked. "It has pictures of really big machines." "It's a catalog," Marcus explained. "Shows all the tools and equipment I might need for work. Like a toy catalog, but for grown-ups?" "Exactly like that," Marcus said, surprised by how easy it felt to talk to the boy. Sarah sat down reluctantly, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "Mrs. Morrison, you really didn't need to." "Sarah," Sally interrupted gently, "Marcus here runs a logging business, and he's been struggling with the office side of things for years. You mentioned you have experience with bookkeeping and administrative work. Seems to me like you two might be able to help each other out." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions and possibilities. Marcus studied Sarah's face, seeing the hope she was trying not to show, the pride that was warring with her practical need for work. "What kind of experience do you have?" Marcus asked quietly. "I managed the office for a small construction company back in Nevada," Sarah said. "Payroll, accounts receivable, filing contracts, scheduling. Nothing too fancy, but I kept their books clean and their paperwork organized." She paused. "I also have a degree in business administration, though that feels like a lifetime ago now. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Sarah was clearly overqualified for anything he could offer, which made him wonder again about what had driven her to Oregon. The thing is, Marcus said carefully, my operation isn't very big. I'm mostly a one-man show. I'm not sure I could afford to pay someone what they're worth. What if we worked out a different arrangement? Sarah said, the words coming out in a rush. I could organize your office, handle your bookkeeping, maybe help you bid on larger contracts so you could expand your business. In exchange, you could provide housing and a small salary. Nothing fancy, just enough for David and me to get by while I look for something more permanent. Marcus stared at her. Housing. I noticed you have a cabin on your property, Sally said helpfully. The old foreman's quarters from when your grandfather ran the logging camp. It's been sitting empty for years. Marcus shot Sally a look. How did she know about the foreman's cabin? Then, again, this was Sally Morrison. She knew everything about everyone in a 50-mile radius. That cabin hasn't been lived in for 20 years, Marcus said. It would need work. I'm handy with repairs, Sarah said quickly. And I'm not afraid of hard work. David, and I could fix it up in exchange for being allowed to stay there. David looked up from the catalog with interest. Are we going to live in a cabin in the woods? Like pioneers? We're just talking, sweetheart, Sarah said. But Marcus could hear the hope she was trying to keep out of her voice. Marcus found himself looking at David, thinking about the boy's earlier questions about trees and balance. There was something about the kid that tugged at him, a combination of curiosity and resilience that reminded Marcus of himself at that age. Can I think about it? Marcus asked. Of course, Sarah said immediately. I understand it's a big decision. And, honestly, I know this is probably not what you had planned when you helped us out of that ditch. Sometimes the best things in life are the ones we don't plan, Sally said meaningfully. After Sarah and David left to explore the town, Marcus and Sally sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Finally, Sally spoke. You know what I think your problem is, Marcus? I have a feeling you're going to tell me whether I want to know or not. Your problem is that you've been hiding out in those woods for 3 years, telling yourself you like being alone. But I've watched you with that boy for 10 minutes, and I've seen more life in your eyes than I have since before your divorce. Marcus stared into his coffee. That's not fair, Sally. Fair doesn't enter into it. That woman and her boy need help, and whether you want to admit it or not, you need what they're offering too. Not just the bookkeeping. The Lord knows you need that. You need the reminder that you're more than just a man who cuts down trees and lives alone. That evening, Marcus drove out to the old foreman's cabin for the first time in years. He'd avoided it mostly, partly because it reminded him of his grandfather, who'd built it in the 1960s when the logging operation was bigger and required a full crew. But as he walked through the small building, assessing what it would take to make it livable again, he found himself imagining what it might look like with a woman and child living there. The cabin was solidly built, with good bones and a sound roof. It needed cleaning, some electrical work, probably new plumbing in the bathroom, and definitely a fresh coat of paint. But it had 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living area with a stone fireplace. There was even a small covered porch that looked out over the forest. Standing in the main room, Marcus could almost see David at the kitchen table doing homework while Sarah worked at a desk by the window. He could imagine the sounds of daily life, conversation over meals, laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent for too long. The thought scared him more than he cared to admit. Marcus Hayworth had built his solitary life carefully, like a wall designed to keep out disappointment and betrayal. His ex-wife Linda had taught him that people left, that promises meant nothing when something better came along, that opening your heart just gave someone else a target to aim for. But as he locked up the cabin and walked back to his truck, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about the way Sarah had straightened her shoulders when she'd talked about her qualifications, the quiet dignity with which she'd asked for work instead of charity. He thought about David's endless questions and the way the boy had instinctively trusted him. Most of all, he thought about what Sally had said about needing the reminder that he was more than just a man who cut down trees and lived alone. That night, Marcus called his sister in California for the first time in 6 months. Marcus. Jennifer's voice was surprised and pleased. Is everything okay? Everything's fine, Marcus said. I just wanted to ask you something. Do you ever regret leaving Oregon? There was a pause. Why would you ask that? I don't know. I guess I've been thinking about choices lately. About what it means to start over. Starting over isn't about running away from something, Jennifer said thoughtfully. It's about running towards something better. Why? Are you thinking about making some changes? Marcus looked around his empty cabin, at the silence that had seemed like peace for so long, but tonight felt more like isolation. Maybe, he said. Maybe I am. The next morning, Marcus drove to Sally's motel earlier than usual. He found Sarah and David in the small playground behind the building, David on the swings while his mother pushed him gently back and forth. Higher, Mama, David called, his laughter carrying across the morning air. Any higher, and you'll fly away. Sarah laughed back, and the sound made something warm unfold in Marcus's chest. They noticed him approaching, and David immediately jumped off the swing and ran over. Tree man, are you going to cut down trees today? Maybe later, Marcus said. First, I wanted to talk to your mama about something. Sarah approached more slowly, her expression guarded but hopeful. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, Marcus began. About the arrangement. And I think maybe we should give it a try. Sarah's face lit up before she carefully controlled her expression. Really? You're sure? The cabin needs work, Marcus warned. A lot of work. And my business isn't exactly Fortune 500 material. But if you're serious about wanting to help each other out, then I'm willing to try. We're serious, Sarah said quickly. Very serious. When can we start? How about today? Marcus said, surprising himself with the decision. I could show you the cabin, let you see what you'd be getting into. And maybe you could take a look at my office, see what kind of disaster you'd be taking on. David was bouncing with excitement. Are we really going to live in a cabin? A real cabin with trees all around it. If your mama thinks it's a good idea, Marcus said. Sarah knelt down to David's level. What do you think, baby? Do you want to live in the forest for a while? David's eyes were shining. Can I climb trees? We'll have to ask Marcus about that, Sarah said. Some trees are good for climbing, Marcus said seriously. I could show you which ones are safe. David looked between his mother and Marcus, and then threw his arms around Marcus's waist in an impulsive hug that nearly knocked the breath out of him. Thank you, David said, his voice muffled against Marcus's jacket. Thank you for helping us again. As Marcus awkwardly patted the boy's back, he caught Sarah's eye over David's head. There were tears in her eyes, but she was smiling, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked like she believed things might actually work out. Thank you, she mouthed silently. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. As they walked toward his truck to drive out to the cabin, David chattering excitedly about all the things he wanted to explore in the forest, Marcus realized that Sally Morrison had been right about something. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't feel like he was just surviving his life. He felt like he might actually be living it again. Marcus Hayworth had been cutting timber in the forests of Oregon for 15 years, and in all that time, he had never heard a sound quite like the one that stopped him cold on that rainy Tuesday morning. It wasn't the crack of falling wood or the rumble of machinery that made him shut off his chainsaw and cock his head to listen. It was crying. Human crying. High and desperate, cutting through the steady patter of rain on pine needles. He pulled off his safety goggles and wiped the sawdust from his beard, listening harder. There it was again, somewhere to his left, deeper in the woods where no logging roads reached. Marcus had always been a practical man, the kind who minded his own business and expected others to do the same. At 42, he lived alone in a cabin he'd built with his own hands, worked his timber contracts alone, and generally preferred the company of trees to people. Trees didn't lie, didn't disappoint, and didn't leave you standing at an altar in a rented tuxedo. But that crying tugged at something in his chest that he'd thought he'd buried along with his marriage certificate 3 years ago. Marcus set down his saw and followed the sound, his heavy boots squelching through the wet undergrowth. The crying grew louder, joined now by a woman's voice, urgent and pleading. He pushed through a stand of young firs and found himself at the edge of a small clearing where an old sedan sat tilted at an odd angle, its front wheel buried deep in a hidden ditch. A woman knelt beside the car's open door, her dark hair plastered to her skull by the rain. She was trying to comfort a boy who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, his small frame shaking with sobs that had nothing to do with the cold. It's okay, baby," the woman was saying. But Marcus could hear the tears in her own voice. "Mama's going to figure this out. We just need to get the car out, and then we'll find somewhere warm to stay." Marcus cleared his throat, and both the woman and boy looked up sharply. The woman's hand moved protectively to the child's shoulder, and Marcus saw the wariness in her brown eyes, the way she positioned herself between him and her son. He was used to that reaction. At 6 feet 4 inches with a full beard and arms like tree trunks, Marcus knew he could look intimidating to strangers. "Engine trouble?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle and his distance respectful. The woman's chin lifted with a pride that Marcus recognized immediately. He'd worn that same expression plenty of times when life had knocked him down, and he was too stubborn to admit it. "Just stuck," she said. "We'll manage." Marcus nodded toward the sedan, which was clearly going nowhere without a tow truck or at least another vehicle, and some rope. "That ditch has been catching folks for years. County keeps saying they'll put up signs, but—" he shrugged. "I've got chains in my truck. Could pull you out, if you want." The boy had stopped crying and was staring up at Marcus with wide, curious eyes. There was something about the kid's face that reminded Marcus of his nephew Tommy before his sister moved to California and they'd lost touch. "Why would you help us?" the woman asked, and there was something in her tone that made Marcus's chest tighten, like she'd been disappointed by people before, maybe more than once. "Because you need help," Marcus said simply, "and I've got the means to give it." For a long moment, the only sound was rain hitting leaves and the distant call of a jay. Then, the woman's shoulders sagged slightly, and Marcus saw the exhaustion she'd been hiding behind her defiance. "I'm Sarah Chun," she said finally. "This is my son, David. We were heading to Portland, but I guess I took a wrong turn somewhere back there." "Marcus Hayworth," he replied. "And you're about 40 miles from the main highway. These old logging roads can be tricky if you don't know them." Sarah's face went pale. 40 miles. "But my GPS said." "GPS gets confused up here," Marcus said. "All the tree cover. You're lucky you found a clearing with cell service to call for help." "I didn't call anyone," Sarah said quietly. "My phone died 2 hours ago." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a protective instinct he hadn't experienced in years. Here was a woman alone with her child, stranded in the middle of nowhere with no way to call for help. If he hadn't happened to be working this section of forest today, "Well," he said, "let's get you folks out of here." It took Marcus 20 minutes to walk back to his truck and drive it to the clearing, and another 20 to get the sedan unstuck. The whole time, Sarah hovered nearby, clearly wanting to help, but not sure how. David had climbed into the cab of Marcus's pickup truck and was examining everything with the focused attention only children could muster. "This is a really big truck," David announced when Marcus finished securing his chains. "Do you cut down trees with it?" "Sometimes I haul them with it," Marcus replied. "But I use a saw to cut them down. Different tool for different jobs." "My dad used to say that," David said, and something in his voice made Marcus glance at Sarah. Her face had closed off, become carefully neutral in the way that told Marcus there was a story there, and probably not a happy one. "Your dad sounds like a smart man," Marcus said carefully. "He was," David replied matter-of-factly. "But he's dead now. Mama says he's watching us from heaven, but I think he's probably too busy to pay attention all the time." Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. He looked at Sarah again, saw the way her jaw tightened, and her eyes fixed on something in the distance. A widow. She was a widow traveling alone with her young son, and from the look of that packed car, they weren't just taking a vacation. "All set," Marcus called, though his throat felt thick. "Your car should start up fine now." Sarah approached him as David climbed down from the truck. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing," Marcus said. "Happy to help." "Please," Sarah said, reaching into her purse. "You've done so much already. I can't just—" "You can," Marcus interrupted gently. "And you will. Because sometimes people help each other just because it's the right thing to do." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus saw something in her expression shift, like she was seeing him clearly for the first time. "Where in Portland are you headed?" he asked. "I could write down some directions to help you avoid the back roads." Sarah hesitated, and in that pause, Marcus heard volumes. "We're not exactly sure yet," she said finally. "We're looking for a fresh start. David and I, we've been through some changes recently." The carefully chosen words told Marcus everything he needed to know about what kind of changes she meant. He'd heard that tone before, from his sister when she'd finally left her husband, from the waitress at the diner in town when she'd talked about why she'd moved to Oregon from Nevada. "Well," Marcus said, "Portland's a good place for fresh starts. Big enough to get lost in if you need to, small enough to feel like home eventually." "Have you lived here long?" Sarah asked. "All my life, pretty much. Grew up about 20 miles south of here. Been working these forests since I was 18. He paused. "It's quiet country, but it's good country. Safe." The word safe seemed to resonate with Sarah in a way that confirmed Marcus's suspicions about what kind of fresh start she was seeking. David had wandered over to examine a fallen log, and Marcus could see the boy was tired despite his earlier curiosity. The kid's clothes were a little too thin for the weather, and Marcus noticed Sarah's jacket had seen better days too. "Listen," Marcus said, making a decision that surprised him even as the words left his mouth. "I know this is forward of me, and feel free to say no, but there's a decent motel about 10 miles back toward the highway. Clean, reasonable rates, and the owner's a good woman. If you're looking for somewhere to stop for the night and figure out your next move, it might be worth considering." Sarah looked at him carefully. "You're not trying to?" "No," Marcus said quickly, understanding her caution. "I'm not trying to anything except help a neighbor in need. You don't know me from Adam, and you're right to be careful. But Sally Morrison, who runs that motel, has been looking after travelers for 30 years, and she's got a reputation for being straight with folks." Something in Marcus's tone must have convinced Sarah he was sincere, because her posture relaxed slightly. "Thank you," she said. "That's very kind." Marcus wrote down directions on the back of a business card and handed it to her. As Sarah took the card, their fingers brushed briefly, and Marcus was surprised by the jolt of awareness that ran through him. It had been a long time since he'd felt anything like that. "Drive careful," he said. "These roads can be tricky even when you know where you're going." Sarah nodded and called to David, who came running with a pine cone in each hand and dirt on his knees. "Can I keep these?" David asked his mother, holding up his treasures. "Of course, baby," Sarah said, smoothing his hair. "Say thank you to Mr. Hayworth for helping us." David looked up at Marcus solemnly. "Thank you for helping us," he said. "Are you going to cut down more trees today?" "Probably," Marcus replied. "It's what I do." "Do the trees mind?" David asked with the earnest curiosity of childhood. The question caught Marcus off guard. In 15 years of logging, no one had ever asked him that. "I only cut down trees that are ready," Marcus said after a moment. "And I plant new ones to replace them. It's about balance." David nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Mama says everything in life is about balance." Marcus glanced at Sarah, who was watching the exchange with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Your mama sounds like a wise woman," Marcus said. They were walking back toward the cars when David suddenly stopped and tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mama," he said in a loud whisper that carried clearly to Marcus. "Is he a good guy or a bad guy?" Sarah knelt down to David's level, her voice gentle but serious. "What do you think, sweetheart?" David studied Marcus for a long moment with the frank assessment only children could manage. "I think he's a good guy," he said finally. "He has kind eyes, and he helped us even though we're strangers." "I think you're right," Sarah said softly, and when she looked up at Marcus, there was something different in her expression, something that looked almost like hope. As Marcus watched them drive away, Sarah waving from the driver's seat, and David's face pressed to the rear window, he felt an unexpected hollowness in his chest. The forest seemed quieter somehow, more empty than it had in years. He stood there long after their car had disappeared around the bend, listening to the rain and trying to understand why helping two strangers had left him feeling like he'd lost something rather than gained it. He picked up his chainsaw and tried to get back to work, but concentration eluded him. Every few minutes, he found himself glancing toward the road, half hoping to see that old sedan come back around the corner. When his phone rang an hour later, he actually jumped, but it was just his foreman calling about a delivery schedule. That evening, Marcus drove past Sally Morrison's motel on his way home, telling himself he was just curious, that it was perfectly normal to wonder if the people he'd helped had found somewhere safe to spend the night. The sedan was parked outside room 12, and Through the window, he could see the warm glow of lamplight. For a moment, he considered stopping, maybe checking to see if they needed anything else. But that felt presumptuous, invasive even. They were strangers who'd happened to cross his path for a few hours, nothing more. Tomorrow they'd continue on to Portland and their new life, and he'd go back to cutting timber and living alone in his cabin in the woods. That's what Marcus told himself as he drove home. But as he heated up a can of soup for dinner and listened to the silence that filled his small house, he couldn't shake the memory of David's curious questions or the way Sarah had looked at him when her son declared him a good guy. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus Hayworth's carefully ordered solitary life felt less like peace and more like loneliness. And he had no idea what to do about that. Outside, the rain continued to fall, drumming against his roof with the same steady rhythm that had been the soundtrack to his days for as long as he could remember. But tonight, somehow, it sounded different. Tonight, it sounded like the timer on a life he was no longer sure he wanted to live.